Okay, hello everyone. Apologies about that. It turns out that my software only allows me to record for 120 minutes, so 2 hours. Did not know that I was getting on for that long. I will try to finish this as quick as I can. So this is part 2 for paper 2 Edexcel B Geography GCSE walkthrough. Now, I had just got halfway through talking about fieldwork, and I would like to finish looking at fieldwork. So just quick refresher then, we're on to section C, which is the third part or the third section of paper 2. This has two sections to it, C1, which is your physical geography fieldwork, and C2, which is your human geography fieldwork. That will be question 8 or 9 of physical. So HLS geographers, you're going to do question 9 on rivers, and 10 or 11 on your human fieldwork, which for us HLS geographers is going to be question 10, which is about Nuneaton. Now, if we skip down on the actual exam paper here, I'll just show you what this looks like. Here we are on section C1. Give me a sec, I'm just going to skip across here. Here we go. And this is what we were looking at earlier. Okay, so section C1, you'll be given that choice of either doing question 8 or 9. Again, first question 8 is on coasts. If you did coastal work, you'll do that. HLS geographers, you're going to come down and do rivers. And you can see we've got a suggest to marker. Suggest questions mean you have to use the resource for your initial point and then develop it like an explain question. We've got a 4 marker suggest here. Again, initial points have to come from the resource. Develop it using your key phrases like explain. It wants 2 points here, which means that we start with the phrase firstly and secondly. Describe the results for marker. Go to the end of my first video. I've gone through how to do that. And then here you see we've got an 8 marker. And this 8 marker is what we call a familiar fieldwork 8 marker, because it's asking you here to talk about your fieldwork. It's familiar to you because you did it. So it asks you to name here your river environment. That was poorly done by me, which for my geographers will be Cardinal Valley. And then it asks you to assess the role of secondary data sources in your investigation for 8 marks. Because it's an assess question, I'm going to pick out the key geographical phrase, which is secondary data sources. I'm going to do 3 different points, 3 different factors. They're going to be peel paragraphs, and I'm going to link back at the end of each peel paragraph to this secondary data sources phrase, and I'll say how important each of my peel paragraphs are. And within each peel paragraph, I'm going to make sure that I include evidence, which will be from my knowledge of my field work, and then I'm going to make a 2-3 sentence conclusion, which is a judgment linking back to the question. Again, we answer the assess questions like every assess question. Go back to the first video on paper 1, thumbnail assess questions if needed, or go to paper 2 walkthrough and look at me talking about assess part 1 and look at me talking about assess questions earlier on. We're now going on to the second section. So you can see it says C2, and you need to do question 10 or 11. 10 is urban, 11 is rural human fieldwork. And for my geographers, you are looking at question 10, HLS geographers. And here we've just got an explain question, so that'll be 1 developed point. And I was talking about this question when my previous video ended. And I just want to finish this and then move on to a last bit of help on the assess 8 marker. So if we go over to the visualizer, and I just maximize this, let's move this over. So you might get a question that asks you to use an annotated, and now here from June 2018, it talks about an annotated sketch map. It could be an annotated diagram, or it could ask you to annotate an image of your data presentation from your fieldwork. All I want to point out here is annotations means labels with explanation. So this student, and this is a student response from last year's exam that the exam board have used as a model answer. Here you can see that this student is explaining in their labels. Now, if you're asked to do something similar to this, this question is asking you to explain. So we'll use key phrases to develop points, but it's you explaining the annotated sketch, and it's asking you to explain why you chose your site. So that's where you did your measurements. You must know that for both your urban and physical fieldwork. This student has used the Burgess model to explain that they chose a site in the inner city and in the suburbs, and they've gone on to explain where those two sites were, and they've tied it to quality of life and deprivation, which is what I'd expect my students to do in the human fieldwork section on C2. What I would like us all to do if you get a similar question like this, you should use a key. Make sure you do that. I would like you to include a title. Make sure you do that as well. And you can see they've titled this figure and they've titled this figure here. Make sure you use annotations, so that is labels with explanation. I would also recommend that you include a scale if you can, or if it's appropriate, and also potentially use compass directions. So it might be appropriate for you to put on, okay, your north bearing there. If you get a question about data presentation, so they ask you to include an annotated form of data presentation from your fieldwork, make sure that you actually add what the different axes, so your y and x and y axes, make sure you say what those axes are, okay? And at the bottom here, this student has referenced their figures in their explanation, okay, so that they can tell the examiner why they chose those sites. Okay. Last thing to do is to look at the 8 marker. So if we go back to the actual exam paper, you'll find that you get an 8 marker at the end of C1, and you're also going to get an 8 marker at the end of C2. This is C2's 8 marker. This one is what we call unfamiliar. It's not the fieldwork you did. So here they've given us a scenario. This is the scenario. And then they've asked you to assess the evidence for that scenario. So you're going to get 2 8 markers in the last section, section C, 1 8 marker for C1, 1 8 marker for C2. They'll be assess or evaluate. Most of them are assess. And what they want you to do here is in one of these C's, so either on the physical or on the urban, one of them will be familiar fieldwork, what you did, 8 marker. The other one will be an unfamiliar piece of fieldwork, 8 marker. Now, what we need to do on the unfamiliar, and actually before we get into that, if we have a look at the 8 markers that have been produced so far, so these are all the 8 markers that have been produced for this paper, and we're going to look at paper question 9 and 10. So 9, 10 is fieldwork. You can see where I've put in brackets if it's familiar or unfamiliar. So this here, we've got question 9 is assess the role of secondary data sources in your investigation. That was familiar. Next one, this is going through the 2 mocks and last year's exam. Assess the suitability of students' choice of sites to investigate the impact of changing river discharge and drainage basin characteristics on flood risk, unfamiliar. And then using the conclusions from your geographical investigation, assess the accuracy and reliability of your results, familiar. Question 10, assess the evidence for this conclusion. That was unfamiliar from last year. evaluate, the only evaluate question that has been produced on any of these exams, evaluate the relative importance of primary and secondary data in your investigation, and lastly, assess the evidence for this conclusion, which was unfamiliar. So within the fieldwork, you'll get familiar and unfamiliar questions. And to help you with that, remember it's all about AO3 and AO4, okay, which is applying your knowledge and using your skills to deconstruct, unpick, tear apart resources. Now, I showed you this earlier. Here it is. We were looking at this in the first video for paper 2. Now, you must know this inquiry process. I went through it earlier, 1 through to 7. You must know that process, okay? And remember, they're not going to ask you questions on what you did, but why you did it. And I went through that you need to know your primary and secondary data. You need to know one piece of quantitative, positive, negative, one piece of qualitative, positive, negative. You need to know your physical, environmental agency, flood risk map, secondary data, positive, negative, and your index of multiple deprivation, positive, negative for your human study. And then you also need to know what an example of random, systematic, and stratified sampling that you did for both physical and human, and you need to know the positive and negatives of each. Now, I should have said in the end, in that video, the first video, where do you get this information from? Which is, you need to go to your booklet, okay? So in the booklet that we produced for you, we go through the inquiry question, your hypothesis. Here, this is collecting your fieldwork data, what quantitative and qualitative means, and then this is for physical rivers. Here we go through the methods. We state if it was quantitative and or qualitative. So qualitative is here, and we say why you did it, what was good about it, and any errors, disadvantages, weaknesses of it. So you must learn one qualitative and one quantitative, this column and this column for physical and for human. On the reverse, we've put about secondary sources, and within this, we've talked about the positives, advantages, and negatives, disadvantages of the environmental flood risk map. Here, we've given you a worked example of a question on annotating, okay, annotation, which I just went through a couple of minutes ago. So here's a worked example of what you could use. We've also included a worked example that you might get on explaining and annotating a piece of data presentation you did. And the same here for Nuneaton. Okay, we've got your key question. This is for your human question 10. Key questions and hypothesis. I would complete this task here so you understand why you made these. Down here, again, we've gone through the methods of how you collected your data, if it was quantitative or qualitative. We've bolded what type of sampling it was. We've said what was good, why you did it, what the problems were. And on the reverse here, secondary data sources, the IMD, index of multiple deprivation, learn to spell it. We've said what was good and bad about using it. We've given you an example of annotating a form of data collection. And then the bottom here is some questions on conclusion evaluation I would complete and learn. So by ensuring that you know the positive and negatives here, here, and here via using your booklet, you should be all right with those questions. Last thing to point out is for the 8 markers, the questions that we can see on the screen right now are mainly about assessing the evidence of a conclusion or the accuracy and reliability of your results. So it's mainly looking at this bit, number 1 of the inquiry process 3, or here at the end of it. So it's asking you here to assess your conclusions or your results. Now, to do that, if on your own fieldwork or the unfamiliar fieldwork, so here is the unfamiliar fieldwork. So this is our unfamiliar 8 marker, and you'll get 1 familiar and 1 unfamiliar 8 marker in your paper 2 exam. With your own fieldwork, whether the 8 marker is making you assess or evaluate your results or your conclusions and evaluations, or the way that you collected data, or on the unfamiliar, if it's asking you to do the same to assess the conclusions and evaluations or the way they collected data or their results, then whatever it is, your familiar fieldwork or their unfamiliar fieldwork, what we need to do is to think about the following. And this is just some questions to help you. So this here are questions to help you think about assessing that data and assessing those conclusions and evaluations. Struggling with the visualizer today. All right, so questions to ask yourself. Number 1, if this is the conclusion or evaluation or results or methods of collection, is it representative? And use that phrase, representative, okay? What that means is, does the data accurately represent the population? So remember, sampling frame, that is the entirety of the population that your study is based upon, okay? But remember, we can't sample everyone or everything within that frame. So we have to decide on what we're going to sample, the snapshot, okay? And whatever our sample is, whatever the snapshot is, does it actually truly represent the population? Here's an example. Let's say someone did some data collection on a street in a town, but they only ended up sampling women aged between 20 and 25. That would be unrepresentative because the population will have more than just that demographics within it. So that's number 1. Number 2, ask yourself, is it valid? Okay. So over here, is it valid? And what I mean by that is, whatever you're looking at, think, is the method that they've chosen or that you chose actually suitable to answer the question? So whatever the question was, whatever the hypothesis were, does the method chosen actually was it actually suitable to answer the question? That would make it valid. Okay, so for example, how does the width of a river change from site 1 to 3? You're measuring the width of the river in those 3 sites. Well, that's valid because the method chosen is suitable to answering that question. Okay, so when you look at your fieldwork or the unfamiliar fieldwork, think, is it valid? Next, think about whether it is reliable. And reliable means the extent to which measurements are consistent, okay? What we mean by that is, how often did you do the measurements? Because if we continue to do the measurements or in more detail, did more of them, did them over more time, they should be reliable if they're kicking out the same results, okay? And therefore the data can be trusted. Yes? Oh, sorry about that. So think to yourself, are the results reliable? Would you expect from the data you collected or the data in the unfamiliar fieldwork that the measurements that you're being shown, the data that they've collected, is actually consistent and can be trusted? You're going to be able to trust it more if the results over time, or the more results you collect, end up consistently giving you the same results. Next one, number 4, is when we're looking at our conclusions or evaluations, or we're looking at the unfamiliar fieldwork, is it objective? So what we mean by that, does it potentially look at every single trend, pattern, and relationship? Okay, that would mean we have objectivity, okay, that they haven't, or you haven't missed out looking at particular trends, patterns, or relationships within your data, results, and conclusions. Number 5 is ask yourself whether your evaluations, conclusions, data, or theirs in the unfamiliar fieldwork, is it critical? And that means, are your conclusions supported by evidence, or were their conclusions in unfamiliar supported by evidence? And do we know if those conclusions are valid? Number 6, we can ask whether it is ethical. And what we mean by ethical is how successfully have you, or in the unfamiliar, have they minimized the harm that your investigation may have had upon the environment and the people in it. So whenever we assess data and assess conclusions, evaluations, we can think about how ethical it is. Over here, we can look at, give me a second, whether the data is error-free. Now, in terms of it being error-free, what we mean by that here is, and I'm just going to rewrite this, is whether it has any measurement errors, right. So when we think about errors, so when we look at our data or our conclusions and evaluations, or in a familiar fieldwork theirs, ask ourselves, is there any sources of error? Now, in terms of our sources of error, we could be looking at operator errors, sampling error, and handling errors. All right, sorry about that. So we could be looking at handling errors. So, or manual errors here. So operator errors are errors in which different people collect data, but we get different results. That would be an operator error. Okay, so for example, if we had students collecting bed load from a river, and we have 2 students with the same 10 rocks, they might actually give different results, especially in the power scale. So when they judge which number that rock represents, we might get some operator errors. Next one would be sampling errors. Sampling errors are that when we're sampling, we might find that local differences might change our results. And then the third one, or handling or manual errors here. Handling errors are errors that take place during the collection of the data. So for example, when measuring the width of a river, if the tape measure wasn't pulled tight enough, that would be a handling error. Last one to talk about, and it's rubbed out a little bit here, okay, which is there any bias within their results, or your results, or within their conclusions and evaluations, or within your conclusions and evaluations? So the question here is, does the data represent the whole so bias, does the data represent the whole, okay, or has there been missed data? Okay, so think is there any bias? If there isn't any bias, it means that the data collected or the evaluations and conclusions represents everything. Okay, but if choices made, okay, result in there being missed data or conclusions or evaluations formed that have missed potential ideas or data out, then it's going to be biased. So we've got 8 ways to think more critically about assessing data and making conclusions. Now, why this matters is when you come into the 8 markers on fieldwork, I would like you to think about that. And when you get that unfamiliar 8 marker, be aware that whatever is given to you is not fully accurate. The exam board have purposely done that. They want you to think about this, okay? Both in you weighing up your fieldwork and when you look at the unfamiliar. Think, is it valid? Is it representative? Is it biased? Is there errors? Is it ethical? Is it critical? Is it objective? Is it reliable? So tear apart the resource. So look, it was only done by 20 students, only on a Wednesday afternoon. They asked 40 randomly selected residents, only 40, okay? But we don't know how they randomly selected. They compared it with the results of a similar survey gathered by students in 2014. So why 3-year gap? What do they mean by similar students who also selected 40 residents? And then the results are shown. So they want you to deconstruct, unpick, tear apart the resource, and then to think critically about it, ask questions, okay, about how valid or how reliable, how representative, how objective, okay, how ethical, how error-free, how biased, okay, are their results, or their conclusions, or their evaluations. So last thing to show us here is an example. And here it is. So this is a student example from the exam board. And all I'm going to do is just highlight where they've used evidence. And they've also thought critically. So here we go. One reason this may be correct is due to certain problems decreasing. For example, pollution and poor services have all decreased since 2014. So that's them picking out evidence from the resource, which is the graph that I was just annotating. Now, they then go on to explain this, but at the end here, it shows that they're thinking critically. However, they only asked 20 people, so the evidence may be unreliable. At the bottom here, you can see that they're picking out evidence from the resource about crime in 2014. And then they're thinking critically at the end here. Although this shows no improvement, it could be due to them only asking on a Wednesday afternoon, so more old people would have answered due to school and work. There we go. So they're thinking critically, they're asking questions about the conclusions. This could be a question about conclusions or evaluations, data, or the methods of collecting data, but they're using evidence from the resources, and then they're thinking critically about that data. Must do this in the familiar and unfamiliar 8-mark fieldwork questions using that 8-mark assess structure, so 3 developed points, 3 PL paragraphs, and making sure that you do a 2 to 3 sentence conclusion. That's it on fieldwork. I hope that was helpful. Sorry for any of the problems. That's it, we're done.